This was not an accident. It was a murder. The murder did not happen on the street, nor in the darkness. It happened under the stage lights of the Le Mans circuit, before tens of thousands of cheering spectators and millions watching on television. The murderer did not use a gun. They used a striped piece of cloth. We are talking about the 19th of June, 1966. That year's Le Mans was no longer a race. It was a crusade, a total war between two industrial empires, America's Ford and Italy's Ferrari. Henry Ford II, a man of assembly lines and billion-dollar contracts, had been insulted by Enzo Ferrari, Il Commendatore, just before a buyout deal was to be signed. That rejection wasn't just a failed business deal. It was a slap in the face of America. And Ford decided to retaliate, not just by beating Ferrari, but by crushing them, by winning at Ferrari's own most sacred temple. The cost? Irrelevant. Manpower? Unlimited. Ethics? A vague concept. That was the backdrop. Onto this battlefield stepped a man. Not a CEO, not a politician, but a driver. A master mechanic with a Birmingham accent and a heart dedicated solely to speed. His name was Ken Miles. To Ford's engineering team, to Carroll Shelby, Miles was not just a driver. He was the soul of the GT40, the tester, the developer, the one who made that machine of steel and aluminum breathe and live. He understood the car better than anyone. And at the 1966 Le Mans, he was driving with a perfection that defied belief. Miles' Ford GT40 was leading. Not just leading, it was dominating. And as the final hours of the brutal 24-hour race ticked down, an order came from the Ford control booth. Not from Shelby, but from the offices, from the men in suits. The order was simple: slow down, adjust the pace, so that the three leading Fords, Miles's number 1, Bruce McLaren's number 2, and number 5, could cross the finish line together, creating the perfect victory photo for the press. A display of collective power. Ken Miles, the exemplary soldier, obeyed. He slowed down. He waited. And as the three cars entered the final stretch, preparing for the last lap, a confusion arose. A confusion about distances, about starting positions. The officials gave the signal. McLaren's number 2 was ahead of Miles. To create the simultaneous finish, Miles was asked to let McLaren pass. And he did. The checkered flag waved. The race ended. But the victory did not belong to Ken Miles. The victory, on paper, was awarded to Bruce McLaren and Chris Amon in car number 2. The reason? A minor, obscure technical rule. Because McLaren had started a few meters further back on the pit lane, he had covered a slightly longer distance. Though they finished almost simultaneously, McLaren was declared the winner. The man who drove the most perfect car, who led for most of the race, who obeyed the order from the top, was not allowed to stand on the top step of the podium. He was denied an individual victory at Le Mans, a victory any driver dreams of. They say it was a mistake, an unfortunate mix-up of communication and calculation. But look closer. Look at Ken Miles' face on the second step of the podium. It's not the disappointment of an athlete. It is the emptiness of a man who has just seen a truth. The truth that, in the war of giants, heroes are merely pawns. That the collective image matters more than individual greatness. That you can do everything right, drive like a god, and still have what is rightfully yours taken away, simply because it better fits a story those in the back want to tell. Ken Miles did not lose due to lack of skill. He lost because he trusted a system that saw him as a tool. And what happened next was not an accident. It was a decision. That decision was not made at the noisy finish line. It had been nurtured long before, in quiet rooms where suits decided the fate of racing leathers. To understand why Ken Miles could be sacrificed so coldly, you must understand the true nature of the Ford GT40 project at Le Mans. It was not a racing project. It was a massive public relations campaign, a multi-million-dollar marketing move disguised under racing paint. The goal was not for Ken Miles to become a legend. The goal was for Ferrari's prancing horse symbol to be trampled under the wheels of the Ford logo. The glory had to belong to the company, not the man. And Ken Miles was a problem. He was too good, too direct. He was not a company man. He was a pure driver, a grease-under-the-fingernails engineer who would readily curse out any executive from Dearborn who came down to give orders without understanding the car. He represented an uncontrollable technical excellence, an excellence that could overshadow the pre-packaged marketing message. Meanwhile, Bruce McLaren, young, well-spoken, a polished New Zealander, was the perfect face for victory. He was more pliable. He fit the story better. So, when the chance for a historic photo arose, three Fords finishing together, it became the ultimate goal. It would be the image flashed to the world, the absolute, undisputed domination of Ford, a perfect army. In that photo, there was no room for a standout individual. Ken Miles, as the supreme individual performer, became a threat to the perfection of that collective. The pressure began to weigh on Carroll Shelby, the team manager. He was both a bridge and a buffer between drivers like Miles and the Ford executives. Calls from America were made relentlessly. Instructions were given not through direct words, but through implications, through leading questions. Would a shared victory create greater resonance, Carroll? Which image do you think the press would prefer, do you suppose? There was no official memo, no direct order saying strip Miles of the win. Just a suffocating atmosphere where the right thing for Ford became the only command. Shelby, though he valued Miles, was trapped. The project, the careers of hundreds, even his own future, hung in the balance. Victory had to go to Ford at all costs, and all costs began to take on a face, a name. On the track, Miles knew nothing of these exchanges. He only knew how to drive, and he drove like a god, to the point where the order to slow down so your teammates can catch up became irrational from a racing standpoint, but perfectly logical from a political one. When he saw the signal from the control booth, his rebellion was fleeting. He was a soldier. He obeyed. And then, after all that, after sacrificing speed, sacrificing a safe lead, sacrificing a driver's instinct to win for the sake of the perfect photo, he still did not get the prize. The trap had sprung. The miscalculation of starting positions, something Ford's vast team should never have allowed, became the perfect paper-thin reason to award the win to McLaren. Everything still looked plausible, still explainable, an unfortunate error. But in the silence of the control booth after the race, there was no shock, no outrage at an injustice. Just a heavy silence. A silence of people who knew they had just witnessed something that had been allowed to happen, if not by direct conspiracy, then by a willing acceptance of an outcome unfavorable to one man for the benefit of a symbol. They didn't need to change the rules. They just needed to do nothing, to let things unfold as the mistake dictated. And Ken Miles stood there on the second step of the podium, looking up at the American flag, listening to the national anthem play for Ford's victory. A victory to which he contributed the most, but which did not bear his name. Under the stage lights, he had seen the true shadow of the giant machine he served. It was no longer a race, it was a political drama, and his role had been pre-written. They didn't need to do anything more to him. They just needed to wait, because the system, once set in motion, would automatically remove threats to its own stability. The punishment did not come in the form of a dismissal letter or a public indictment. It came in the form of deliberate neglect. Just 2 months after the bitter glory of Le Mans, Ken Miles went to Riverside, California, to test a new, more powerful version of the GT40, codenamed the J car. It was a routine test day. Miles, as the chief test driver and the man who knew the car best, was pushing it to its limits. On the final straight, at extreme speed, the car suddenly lost downforce, spun sideways, and slammed head-on into a concrete embankment. It disintegrated. Ken Miles died instantly. They say it was an accident, a tragedy of a dangerous profession. And that is true. Racing is perilous, but place Miles's death in the context of what happened at Le Mans. After being stripped of the victory, Miles fell into an indescribable state. Not exactly anger, but a profound, saddened disillusionment. He saw clearly where he stood on the grand chessboard. His credibility, once his strongest weapon, had been damaged. His voice within the team no longer carried the same weight. Ford had gotten their historic victory. The image of 3 Fords finishing together was printed in every newspaper. The story of the great collective had been told. Ken Miles, the complex, difficult man with a personal grievance, became a destabilizing element, an uncomfortable reminder of the victory's cost. And then he was assigned to test the J car, a prototype with a new aluminum honeycomb monocoque design, lighter, theoretically stiffer, but not thoroughly proven at extreme speeds. There were concerns about aerodynamic stability, but the pressure to keep developing, to keep beating Ferrari, was immense. The testing pace had to be fast. The accident happened. The technical cause was given, excessive lift at the rear at high speed, a body design that was rigid but did not absorb crash energy, causing it to shatter rather than deform to protect the driver. But there is a small detail, a final clue. In later letters and conversations, some close engineers would whisper about a feeling. The feeling that after Le Mans, Ken Miles seemed not to be listened to as carefully as before. His warnings, if any, about the new car may not have been considered with the utmost urgency as they once would have been. Not because they wanted him dead. No one wanted that. But because, in the new hierarchy of priorities, his voice had been devalued. He had become an asset with associated risk. Ken Miles's death was a genuine tragedy, but it was also the final, bloodiest consequence of a decision made 2 months earlier in France. The decision that this individual could be sacrificed for a larger narrative. And once a person has been marked as expendable, their environment, whether by accident or design, becomes less safe. Ford's victory at the 1966 Le Mans was a historic turning point. It changed the game forever. But the driver most deserving of that win did not have his name on the championship cup that year. And then he was denied the chance to compete for it ever again. They didn't need to eliminate him. The system, with its cruel indifference, did it for them. History records that Ford defeated Ferrari. History praises the collective victory. History views Ken Miles' death as an unfortunate accident in a dangerous sport. History forgot to mention that sometimes the true hero does not die on the battlefield. They die in the shadow of the very glory they created. After Ken Miles' death, everything carried on. The racing world kept turning. Ford continued to dominate Le Mans in the following years. The GT40s kept winning. Bruce McLaren, the 1966 victor, became a legend, founding his own racing team and the supercar brand that bears his name. The story of the American invasion at Le Mans was retold as an epic of perseverance, technology, and will. Ken Miles gradually became a footnote, a side story for ardent fans. In mainstream documentaries about Ford versus Ferrari, he appears as a talented supporting character, a personal tragedy within a grand success story. The complexity, the injustice, and the true cost behind the photo of 3 cars finishing together were blurred. It was simplified to an unfortunate miscalculation. He wasn't erased. He was merely diminished, placed in the precise position required by official history, a touch of bitterness to accentuate the glory, not a crack that could undermine the entire ethical foundation of that narrative. The J car, the cause of his death, was scrapped shortly after. The design was reevaluated. The honeycomb technology was abandoned. Lessons were learned, paid for in blood, and applied to the next generation of cars. The GT40 that won in 1967 and 1968. But the man who paid with his life for those lessons was seldom mentioned in the technical reports. Carroll Shelby went on to his illustrious career, becoming an American icon. But those close to him say Miles' death was a wound he carried for life, a burden he seldom spoke of. It was the dark part of a legend's halo. And the Miles family? They lived with the loss, with a championship cup that did not bear the name of their husband, their father, with the knowledge that his name would forever be attached to a mistake and an accident, rather than to pure brilliance. So, what does this story leave us with? It leaves no clear conspiracy, no mustache-twirling villain with a knife behind the scenes. It leaves a more complex, more human, and therefore more painful truth. The mechanism of grand ambitions. When an objective becomes too large, too important, winning a war, defeating an icon, making history, then people, with their desires, their recognition, and even their safety, can become negotiable numbers. Ken Miles wasn't killed by someone. He was consumed by a machine. That machine was named victory. It was named public relations. It was named legacy. And the final question is not, who gave the order? It is, when we celebrate great victories, do we ever pause to consider the invisible prices that were paid? Are we willing to look at the historic photo of the 3 Fords finishing together and see, in the gap between car number 1 and number 2, the ghost of a man history left behind? The story of Ken Miles is a warning, not about greed or malice, but about complacency. The complacency of accepting that some people, no matter how talented, can become acceptable sacrifices for a better story, a more perfect photo, a grander legacy. And are we, as the audience, inadvertently cheering for that mechanism every time we glorify the victory while forgetting its cost? Today, over half a century later, the story of Ken Miles has finally been told more fully. It appears in in-depth books, in long-form articles, and was brought to the masses through a Hollywood film titled Ford v. Ferrari. The world finally knows his name. But even in that recognition, there is irony. The film, though excellent, is still a narrative. It needs emotional arcs, a meaningful conclusion. It turned Ken Miles into a martyred saint, a romantic hero crushed by the system. And that is true, in a way. But it also simplifies the truth once more, this time into a palatable personal tragedy. It makes us weep for Miles, despise the faceless Ford bosses, and feel satisfied when Shelby punches through an office window. It resolves the emotion. But the truth is harder and grayer than that. The truth is there were no cackling, evil villains in the shadows. The truth is a collection of talented, ambitious men swept up in a machine they collectively built. A machine of victory pressure, of massive investment, of national pride. Within that machine, decisions weren't always malicious. Sometimes they were just the choice of the easier path, the less disruptive compromise for the greater good. And Ken Miles became that point of compromise. His true legacy is not a lost trophy. It is a persistent question his story poses to any field of high-stakes competition, from sports to business to politics. Where is the line? When does the price of glory become too high? Not in currency, but in humanity. The GT40 he drove became a legend, but its true soul, the intuitive understanding, the bravery to push it to the edge, the perfectionist grit of a craftsman, was lost with him that day at Riverside. Technology can be replicated. A person cannot. So, how should we remember Ken Miles? Not just as a victim or a brilliant driver, but as a mirror. A mirror that shows that behind every great victory, every historical leap, there are often untold stories of choice and sacrifice. And sometimes those most deserving of remembrance are the ones whose names are not on the cup, but whose imprint is deep in the very grain of history's course. He reminds us that history is not only written by the winners, but also by the voices that were drowned out, the truths that were overlooked, and the prices that were paid in silence. And stories like this, they never truly disappear. They just wait to be retold. Ultimately, this story is not really about a car race, nor is it just about a man being stripped of a victory. This is a story about the eternal conflict between the individual and the system, between purity and expediency. Ken Miles represented the ultimate purity of skill, of passion, of uncompromising excellence. The system he served, the giant machine of Ford, of media, of history-making, operated on expediency, on calculation, on shaping the most advantageous narrative. The 1966 Le Mans race was where these two forces collided, and the system won. It did not win by crushing the individual, but by absorbing and reshaping him, turning his excellence into fuel for its own story, then gently discarding the parts that didn't fit the script. The stolen victory at Le Mans was not the end. It was proof the system had engaged. The death at Riverside, however accidental, was the tragic full stop written by the same logic. That individual, with the emotional and historical baggage he now carried, had become an unnecessary variable. Once that mechanism is triggered, once it is established that the collective goal outweighs individual worth, there is no turning back. Everything unfolds with an inevitable flow, from the command to slow down for the photo finish, to the quiet devaluation of his voice, to the tragic final test on a straight at Riverside. This is the chilling nature of the system. It rarely kills with intent. It kills with priority. It didn't murder Ken Miles. It simply decided, step by logical step, that other things were more important than his singular brilliance, his rightful glory, and ultimately his safety. And in that towering hierarchy of priorities, a man can fall, and the machine will barely shudder as it rolls on toward its next victory. The story of Ken Miles is a testament to the fact that true greatness often shines brightest not in the spotlight of achieved glory, but in the stark, unforgiving light of what was sacrificed to make that glory possible for others. He didn't just lose a race. He became the unanswered question at the heart of every victory we too easily celebrate. Subscribe if you believe these stories deserve to be remembered, and challenge them in the comments if you don't.